Hello to anyone watching this in the future. My name is Anton Schultz, and I'm currently the youngest person to have completed a birding big year in Southern Africa. For those of you that don't know what a birding big year is, I will get to that in just a second. Firstly, I would like to thank President Ridge, WITS, and BirdLife Northern Gauteng Bird Clubs for having invited me to give a talk. And if anyone of you is interested in me giving this talk to you live, you can get a hold of me on antonschultzphotography@gmail.com, listed right here. Secondly, I'd like to mention a charity drive for the critically endangered white-winged flufftail, which I'm currently raising money for in association with BirdLife South Africa. Over 10,000 Rand has already been raised, and if you would like to help, you can purchase a white-winged flufftail t-shirt here for 200 Rand. If you're interested, just email Anton Schultz Photography. Okay, so without further ado, this is an African penguin. A jackass penguin for those of you that are old school or just plain cheeky. This isn't just any penguin though. It's actually one that I hold close to my heart. And that's because this is the bird which started one of the greatest adventures of my lifetime, my big year. A big year is fairly easily explained. You travel around a designated area and see as many species of birds as you possibly can within a calendar year. In Southern Africa, the classic goal is to reach 800 species of birds across these countries. But getting the magic of it across to someone who has no interest in birds is pretty tough. So you spend a year doing nothing but looking at birds. Yep. What do you win? Nothing. So why do you do it? Because birds. In truth, a big year is overwhelming, exhilarating, horrifying, and literally one of the greatest experiences you can ever open yourself up to. And by sheer luck, at the beginning of 2019, I was given the opportunity to go for it in Southern Africa. Three things motivated me to do this originally in 2015. One was this movie, which alerted me to the existence of the year when I was new to birding. Two, a speech given in 2015 by a man named John Kinghorn, who in 2014 was the last person to complete the Southern African big year. And three, this should disappoint a lot of you, I wanted a big list. All right, to give myself a little credit, it wasn't entirely that. I wanted to see more of the world, and I genuinely wanted to see new birds for the love of birds. In 2018, unbelievably, I got the go-ahead from my parents. I got one more piece of inspiration during a whole lot of self-doubt by another movie called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which I really would suggest that you all watch. I'd found the cheapest 4x4 that looked reliable that I could find, a Mitsubishi Pajero 1999. I finished my matric year and I got my driver's license with little time to spare. By all accounts, I was technically ready for the adventure of a lifetime. And then my car broke down a few weeks before 2019. The car would only eventually be fixed by February the next year. So until then, I had to figure out a plan. Luckily, my dad was going to Cape Town in any case for New Year's, and we decided to make a trip of it. So in my opinion, or at least for me, there are effectively 5 stages to a big year. Phase 1, fast-paced terror. Phase 2, the cool down. Phase 3, the build-up. Phase 4, fast-paced adventure. And phase 5, the golden hour. While all the themes of these phases will intersperse with each other throughout the year, you'll generally notice one dominating a certain portion. So let's jump right into phase 1. How do you define it? Phase 1, fast-paced terror. Abstract noun, absolute terror of uncertainty, weight load, inexperience, and a broken car. Day 1 and the first post of my big year, back when I still attempted to make my posts sound formal. What an amazing day 1 yesterday with Garrett Skeet and Luke Goddard birding the West Coast route, with a lot of endemic scene, some tricky erratics taken care of, and a pretty great base year list to start it all off of. I don't think the first of the year could have gone any better. Total year bird count, 118. January will inevitably be the busiest stage of any big year, because you're starting out on literally 0 species. Everything is new and there's nothing you can glance over. not even a Cape sparrow. But you're going to see plenty of Cape sparrows throughout the year, Anton, someone might logically tell you. And to that, I'd say, I don't believe you, as I draw a game plan for a bulb or something. This is the portion of the year where you're most paranoid because you haven't even figured out what's going to elude you yet. And trust me, there's going to be some stuff to elude you. For example, I saw red-necked phalarope, Eurasian oystercatcher, gull tern, grey wagtail, and a golden pipit before I saw a crested barbet. The numbers during this phase were also pretty ridiculous. I got bird number 100 on January 1st, 200 on January 8th, 300 on January 13th, and by January 24th, I was on 400 species of birds. I wasn't even a month in, and technically, I was halfway done. I was sleep deprived, hungry, and birds were pretty much the only thing on my mind. So when I think back to this stage, I get in two minds about it. For one, it was birding, pure birding. It's all I originally ever thought I wanted, and it actually was quite a lot of fun. On the other hand, I don't think I was fully appreciating everything around me, because the list was the only thing on my mind. And I went as far as to have mental breakdowns thinking of the year to come and whether I'd attain this all-powerful 800 number, which thinking back on it was pretty stupid. That being said though, the themes of the phases of the year do intersperse, and I had a few unforgettable, amazing moments in January. I got to see my first aardvark with my dad late one night on a farm road on the outskirts of Grahamstown. On the 25th of January, I participated in Eswatini Birding Spectacular, where you set out to see as many species of birds within the borders of Swaziland in one day. I loved the challenge so much that I actually set out to repeat it again this year. I got to walk along the St. Lucia Beach estuary for the first time during my golden pipit switch, a place I became all too familiar with by the end of the year. And I met quite a lot of great people that I still appreciate to this day. So January was overwhelming, but it was fun. February was a little slower paced, until the final stretch when I went to Zimbabwe for the first time and my little South African brain was blown. I was, believe it or not, on quite a tight budget. So with all the new Zimbabwean petrol prices, I couldn't really afford to drive up. So I took the bus, which was interesting. A bus from Joburg to Harare costs around 400 Rand, so the money saved doing it is actually pretty ridiculous. Just know that you're not traveling in style while you do it. And there will invariably on every bus be an old lady making this noise every 30 seconds. That being said though, what an experience it is, and I think a big part of adventure traveling is the weird, funny, and uncomfortable stuff like that. When I eventually got to Harare, I met a man called Derek Adams who would guide me, and it was pretty awesome. I got to spend my first time in Miombo, slowly discovering what was rare and what was common, because before seeing all these birds in person, all they looked like to me was exotic. I also remember the streaky-breasted plovetails, which I think I described pretty well in my Facebook posts. They are like rats. They just don't fly. Flushing one is nearly impossible. Once in a while, you see a small patch of grass moving, and you know it's the plovetail, you just can't get a glimpse of it. No matter how close you get, it'll just outsmart you. At one point, Derek even thought I'd stepped on one. He played this game with us for what was probably 10 plus hours of flushing time before one individual male eventually flushed and gave us a last minute glimpse just a few hours before I needed to be at the airport. That glimpse is more than enough for a lifetime with a bird like this. Well, despite the guilt of trying to flush a plovetail, it was over. Due to some very strange planning, I was in Cape Town. Later that day. How many people can say they saw a streaky-breasted plovetail and a kelp gull on the same day, I wonder. The next day, on the 27th of February, I saw my 500 species when again Garrett Skeet took me out birding and we saw a European honey buzzard together. The day after that, I was actually on the first small boat pelagic of my lifetime, looking at a bunch of spectacled petrels. And by some miracle, I didn't puke, but I did discover that I was seasick. And with that, I was 2 months down in the year, and March was a crazy one. I got to twitch a Madagascar cuckoo, which I'm 99% sure I saw, but I couldn't tick since I never had a confirmable sighting. The twitch was awesome though, and I got to see my first dusky lark, which to this day is my favorite lark with those cute little wing flicks. I was with a guy called Josh Judd, who really loved the Kruger and even kept a bird list for the park. I remember him seeing a speckled pigeon at Crocodile Bridge and losing his mind, and discovering that it was a rarity for the Kruger. Midway through the month, I went on my favorite trip of the year. On one of my favorite trips of the year, my magical KwaZulu-Natal trip. On the post about it, I wrote, I decided to undertake this trip alone, which is definitely an experience of its own. It sees you occasionally dancing in the car, with your favorite playlist on speaker, blue skies above and without a care in the world, and it occasionally sees you reminiscing on the cringiest moments of your life. Trust me, there are a lot of them. It really is an up and down sort of experience, but quite interesting and, dare I say, worthwhile in the end. Traveling alone is one of those experiences you just have to actually try before you understand the beauty in it. Depressingly lonely sometimes. We are humans after all, and we need companionship. But it also allows time for self-reflection and self-discovery. You can't hide from yourself when that's all you're around. I remember seeing some birds in spates of anger at the world. Some were in deep thought, but most were in simple neutrality, which allows you to see birding in a different light. You've got nothing to prove. The last trip of March was an absolute disaster, and I think it ended off phase 1 pretty perfectly. My Facebook summary of this trip reads, the next day saw me heading up to southern Mozambique, what I can quite easily call a disastrous trip called off very short. Perhaps I'll regale the details of it another day, but that day isn't today. Nevertheless, sharp-tailed sandpiper and lesser blackback gull made an appearance, so the trip was worth it. Remember when I talked about the definition of phase 1? Absolute terror, uncertainty, inexperience, and a broken car? That was my first trip to Mozambique in a nutshell. I'd originally decided to do this trip, to do an entire southern Mozambique trip with a guy I was traveling with, but that went south very quickly. So if there's one place I hate more than anywhere else in the entirety of Southern Africa, Komatipoort border post it is. Never have I seen such a wretched hive of scum and villainy as this border post, which preys on your inexperience. Long story short, the trip ended up being called off earlier than I thought it would be, and I developed an irrational fear of Mozambique. Phase 2, the cool down. Definition, winter, a broken car, again, and bad news. In every adventure movie, there's inevitably going to be a part where the protagonist loses hope, or has a fight with his best friend, or the villain of the story looks unstoppable. For me, that was this part of my year. Again, there were some good moments still. The bad goes with the good, and the good goes with the bad. But from what I remember, this was the most anxiety-riddled and depressing time of my year. April didn't start off too badly. Soon after the Mozambique trip had ended, I was already back on the road and on my way to magical Magubskloof. Don't think there's any place I could have gone that would have been better to soothe my nerves than a misty forest wonderland that is Magubskloof. The birding was awesome for the most part, with almost every special showing up with relative ease. The funny moment came when I was going to look for a broad-tailed warbler after fresh rains, and I descended a muddy slope. Getting down was easy. I tried to call the warbler to no avail, no biggie. But getting to the top of this muddy slope was another story. This was the moment I discovered that the diff lock on my car wasn't working properly, and I was stuck at the bottom of the hill. So after multiple attempts of trying to use momentum to get to the top of the hill, only to slide back down every time, I realized I was stuck. Eventually, some construction vehicles came by and winched me out, to my embarrassment. There's this kid in a Mitsubishi Pajero who can't get up a small muddy hill. I must have looked pretty pitiful. The trip went pretty awesomely after that. I visited my dad in Hoedspruit, who was in Hoedspruit at the time, and we got to see a Taita falcon together. I went on top of Marepskop, which is quite stunning. I got to bird with Samson Malawadzi in the Southansberg, and before I knew it, on the 4th of April, after seeing a blue-spotted wood dove, I was on 600 birds for the year. The slow part I talked about came after this. I had to send my car in for repairs once again due to the broken diff lock. And what I didn't know was that this time it wouldn't be coming back until late August. This is why getting a Japanese car where parts have to be ordered from lands far away was a bad idea. So this time I was in for the long haul, and what followed was a birding drought spent mostly at home. The time I spent at home was pretty awful, and instead of using it constructively, I wasted it binge watching series on Netflix and feeling sorry for myself. I attempted to put some more up-to-date plans together while I was at home, but what I'd do when I get my car back, but in the end, I wasn't really sure when I'd get my car back. So I eventually got into something of a depression where I did nothing, because there was nothing to do. I'd already cleaned up Wada Gauteng earlier in the year, apart from one or two oddities which I'd likely find elsewhere. On top of that, the political situation in central Mozambique had deteriorated due to the recent election, and attacks on buses and cars were being reported more regularly. So the people I was planning on going to northern Mozambique with were already getting antsy, and so was I. No Southern African big year is even possible without a trip to Mozambique. So was I even doing a big year? All there was to do really was save my money for a time in the year when it actually needed again, and hope that it went well. In May, I got to go on one trip where I visited my mom in Clarence, which was one of the better moments during this time. We visited Lesotho and we got to see a llama guide together. I briefly visited Wakkerstroom and dipped on Boortseslaag, which meant I'd have to return for it later in the year in any case. In June, I got to go on two pelagics, one from Durban, the other from Cape Town. The Cape Town one turned out to be crazy, with a frontal storm bringing in some crazily rare things, including a southern fulmar. In July, I got to twitch a citrine whitetail and walk St. Lucia once again. I also got to visit Port Elizabeth to see one of the birds I'd been dreaming about since 2018, roseate tern, which I happened to find after a few days of scanning shortly after a root canal surgery. An extract from my post on the 15th of July reads, Monday dawned, and I knew this was the last chance for a roseate. The weather conditions looked a lot better. There were many more exposed rocks and noticeably more terns. We were joined by Matthijs Ravensberg and his monster of a camera at midday. By 2 o'clock, we were sitting near a flock of swift and sandwich terns when a roseate finally made an appearance. My camera had broken down earlier in the trip, so imagine my absolute joy when I got to borrow Matthijs's camera with my own memory card. There I was, sitting not too far away from the roost, my tooth in absolute agony, with a big smile on my face and a professional camera, taking God knows how many pictures of a bird which I'd been dreaming about since last year. And with that, phase 2 of my big year was over, and I was on a measly 638 species for the year. Phase 3, the build-up. Northern Cape and borrowing your brother's car. At the very beginning of August, after a whole lot of reassurance and help from my family, I set off in my brother's Vigo for one of the most imperative trips of the year, the Northern Cape. When I think back to this trip, I actually think to some of the most invigorating parts of my big year. Birding in the Northern Cape isn't particularly difficult, but it is slow, and it's incredibly systematic. You don't have much of a chance of finding a weirder, unexpected species of birds. So for the most part, you can put all your energy into specific targets, and you have to accept that you will not be seeing much in the long silence in between species. But sometimes the moans during all those silences will surprise you. Sometimes they're filled with the most adventure of all. Day 4, up and at 'em, time for covered dunes. It doesn't take a genius to find a red lark here. By the time the day got heated up, they were all over. One of my most absolute favorite larks, no question. The day was a bit slow to follow. I decided to climb an appealing looking mountain because why not? The mountain yielded nothing but a spectacular view of an endless desert. Past the Namis Mountains and directly to another trough in the middle of nowhere, alongside a house. Again, I set up for a long wait. Again, nothing special. Nothing but plenty of Cape sparrows to keep me company. And I was getting a little distraught. About an hour in, with nothing to show, along came a farmer, obviously a bit perturbed as to why someone would want to sit and watch some water on his land for so long. I explained in my terrible Afrikaans. To my surprise, he invited me in for coffee. He then introduced me to another farmer who was going to check up on his sheep and offered for me to tag along. Why not? It was crazy. Ludwig's bastard sackflies, Karoo korans as well, Stark's larks in little groups throughout the farm. And then when we got to the trough, turns out this was where all the birds were hiding. Millions of Damariform black-headed canaries, lark-like buntings, red-headed finch, and so much life in general. This was the spot I'd been looking for. Alas, it was sunset, and a few drinks later with some great guys, and I had to get back to my campsite, with an invitation to return and stay over the next night. Day 5, tent packed up and ready to go with the greatest bowl of cereal ever for breakfast. I headed back to the farmer's land, this time taking a different road in. To my surprise, the road had a little greenery alongside it, not what I was used to in this arid landscape, but it was exactly what I needed. Sure enough, a few kilometers into his farm and an emergency stop ensued. Black-eared sparrowlark. Yes. They were hassle to get a picture of, but hey, I got it. Back to the water trough for a long wait alongside attempting to climb windmill. No sclaters, but some pale-winged starlings and a brief sighting of black-eared sparrowlark, of grey-black sparrowlark kept me happy. The day continued with a great lunch in the veld with Leylard's titbabbler as pre-lunch entertainment. Back at the farmer's house, reading of a book, and I heard a familiar bee-eater-like call. It took me a second when I remembered I was actually hearing a sclater's lark. I ran to get my camera. Answer came with no lark in sight. I ran to the corner of the farmhouse and tried using playback. To my absolute relief, 2 sclaters flew overhead, one replying. I tried to take pictures, but to very bad avail, as they both flew into the sun. Nevertheless, big tick. That night was spent camping alongside a farmer's house, enjoying a campfire and some more cereal, because why not? A very happy sleep indeed. And that was pretty much phase 3 in a nutshell. After one of the roughest parts of my big year, I just got to get back into my groove, and it was awesome. The trip followed with the cleanup of the Western Cape, which is a whole nother adventure of its own. But unfortunately, I don't have enough time to get into that, or else I could be talking for days. Phase 4, fast-paced adventure. Definition, catch-up, a working car, and a stunning country. I don't think there's any other trip of the year where I had as much fun as this one. The Namibian cross-country adventure with my brother. It's a speech of its own. There were so many classic moments during the entirety of it, so many interesting people, most of them found by my brother, such unique bird life and scenery that would just blow your mind. And the best part of it was that the majority of the time you had it to yourself. Day 4, drive to Roebank, crossing some beautiful mountains. Stark's lark along the way as well as plenty of ripples Quran. One of the most special evenings camping alongside the road near Roebank, already visibly Roy in the moonlight. Words can't describe how magical this day actually was. Driving through the Namib and seeing everything you'd always dreamed about Namibia firsthand. Roebank itself is a stunning little town on the edge of the sand dunes. I'd always remembered seeing pictures of this church in the middle of the desert, and there it actually was. It took us a while, but we found a little patch that was adequate enough to set up camp. On one side of the road, there was an edge of a massive expanse of dunes. The other, just emptiness. Day 12. I spent 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. intermittently waking up and vomiting at various points. I spent the day half dead and rather miserable looking. Funniest moments probably put me on Etosha Idiots, where I opened the car door to vomit at a rhino sighting. Got to a lolly camp, where I slept at a reception on the most comfortable chair on earth. Woke up and continued searching for the bear-cheeked babbler, which I eventually got. Made our way to Tandala Ridge for the night, some fantastic mammal sightings along the way, including an aardvark. This was a pretty funny day when I look back on it. So just for some context, there's this drink in Austria called Eindudler, which ever since I've been a child I've loved. It's basically just a herbal lemonade, but because I associate it with nostalgia, I've always sort of glorified it. You don't get this drink in South Africa or anywhere outside of Austria, really. Or at least I thought, until the day came in Omaruru when that we found a petrol station selling the stuff called Farm Doodler, which it turned out was the exact same thing. So my excited self bought about 10 bottles of the stuff, and for 2 days it was pretty much the only thing I drank, which turned out to be a pretty bad when I eventually got dehydrated, or perhaps more likely sugar overloaded. So day 12 turned out to be a pretty terrible one for me. It was basically just my brother driving me around Etosha with me in the passenger seat, periodically falling asleep waking up, asking him to stop the car and vomit. 2 days later, I saw my 700th bird for the year, Burchell's courser. Day 18. Fresh with a coordinate from a friend, today was the day I'd pour my heart into Cinderella Waxbill. When I asked Pete about the spot, he said it used to be reliable, but he had been there a few times prior with no luck. He suggested a good path to get to it, and I was off. So here's how you find the spot. A few kilometers from camp, you pull into a riverbed, set your car into a 4x4, and horrifiedly drive into the sand at high speed. Stop about 300 meters in because you realize that the rocks were stopping you anyway, park in deep river stand like a genius between two villages, and realize you didn't need to actually drive into the riverbed in the first place. Walk up the riverbed, climb up a waterfall, and be surprised at the extent of greenness. Travel upstream for a while and lose it when you actually see the bird. Cinderella Waxbill in the flesh. This comes from Kaneni River Lodge, where I had spent quite a couple of days trying to find a seemingly lost group of Cinderella Waxbills. And I remember the absolute joy that came with eventually finding them in this weird little oasis nearby the lodge. And not only that, but the weird directions that took me to the spot. Day 24. Early wake up and yet another heading off for the shrike spot. No luck. The time ticked away to 10 a.m. and I was back in the car feeling hot and done with this bird. Don't know what came over me then. Screw it, I'm going back in there, I thought. And so back and I went. Sun cream, hat, water bottle, toilet paper, for reasons that I don't think you guys need to know. This time I went in much deeper into the bush. I spent the midday hours scouring the area with no birds sounding a peep. And then at around 2:30 p.m., boom, 2 sozas walking insects around me, finally. Feeling motivated as ever, I headed back to camp, parked my car and ran straight out the camp eastwards to find the other target. This one didn't put up a fight at all. About 2 kilometers in, a flock of sharp-tailed starlings sat in the afternoon light, squawking and feeding at their leisure. I walked back to camp feeling almighty. Another starling flew over me as I entered the camp. What a day. To put this one into context, it was a similar story to the Cinderella Waxbill, except this time we were in the Western Caprivi Strip, and this time, after drinking bad tap water, both my brother and I were sick. So I'd spent the last 2 days looking for the Sosa Shrike in the area, following a similar game plan. I'd stop at this one section of road as early as I could, and I'd walk into the bush. I'd scour the area for the shrike and leave empty-handed by around 11 o'clock. Since by this time, the Namibian heat was unbearable, and to put it nicely, I had a runny stomach. So I remember the sense of accomplishment when I actually found this bird after midday, because on that day, I decided to just not back down, which you've got to decide to do sometimes, especially if you're doing a big year. Perseverance pays off. From here, my brother and I made our way through to the Caprivi Strip, also visiting Chikawe in Botswana briefly. I got to see so many more amazing birds, and we got to meet so many more amazing people along the final leg of the trip. But eventually, and a little abruptly, it had to come to an end, and there was a bigger shark lurking in the final leg of my big year, Mozambique. Phase 5. Definition, looking back and appreciating it all. Whether it was worth the money spent tech-wise is debatable, but twitching a Saunderstone is an epic experience, and experiences are what this big year was about. After returning home from our Namibian trip, I spent a total of 7 hours at home before I got to go on my next trip. And while I was looking forward to what I was going to do once I got there, I was extremely sleep deprived and not ready for the drive. Day 1, 2:50 a.m. wake up with about 6 hours sleep between my last 2 nights. I was off to the Komatipoort border, admittedly hating every minute of my drive. I only effectively woke up by the time I was at Al Zoo and I managed to obtain a coffee. Even then, I was out of it. I met Etienne Marais, as well as Trudy and Henning Malan at the petrol station just outside the border post. Entering the border post was a lot smoother than last time, with Etienne around, needless to say. We then pushed on through to Inaharuso, where we stayed at the Jolly Roger for the evening. I got to bed at around 7:30 p.m., I think. So, despite the fear, I was back in Mozambique, mostly thanks to the fact that I had Etienne Marais to help me cross. The San Sebastian Peninsula was a burning paradise. Heck, it was just paradise full stop. Light blue water, white beaches, birds in numbers that just made your mouth drop, including the Saunders tern. But it was what happened after this that actually made the end of the year what it was. On day 6 of my Mozambique trip, I wrote, "Once we had finished our birding at around midday, we pulled our cars up to a T-junction. Etienne, Trudy, and Henning going south, me going north. The part of the year that has scared me the most since I started planning. Yes, I was going to northern Mozambique alone. 1 month prior, due to an attack on a bus in the town of Gongoza, both the people I'd originally planned to do the trip with, had decided they no longer wanted to join. Were I not doing a big year, I probably would have done the same. But to my surprise, when I told Etienne about my fears of northern Mozambique, he laughed and said this happens every year. After a lengthy conversation, Etienne suggested that I just do it. So that's what I did. Day 9. The day followed with a drive to Mount Tsetsera, where I took a wrong route up the mountain. This was due to my maps being down since I never managed to download offline maps. The path turned out to be interesting, and I ended up by some loggers who I had to ask for spare motor oil in desperation. Yes, I decided to transverse Mozambique without spare motor oil and without maps. How clever am I? Eventually, I managed to find myself on the real path up Mount Tsetsera, and this is where birding exploded. For starters, Orca buzzard, my Namibian nemesis, gave me a gentle flyby on the grasslands going up the mountain. The grass then turned to patches of forest, where the first of my highland specials showed, that being white-tailed crested flycatcher in all of its excitement. In those forest patches, you could hear all sorts of amazing birds. African emerald cuckoo gave me glistening flybys and even perched for me. I could hear Robert's warbler, eastern bronze-necked pigeon, echoing throughout the mountains. Chirinda pallas were noisy but had a habit of not showing in the open. I just sat at this first patch of forest in total awe. What a beautiful country. For a moment, my homesickness was cured. I climbed Tsetsera slowly along the gravel path. Along the way up the mountain, I was serenaded with thousands of Barrett's warbler. A lucky stop and a listen for a faint whistle saw my first red-faced crimson wing of the trip. I got to the top of the mountain after sunset and decided to throw an air mattress on my car roof and sleep there for the evening. Clear skies above, the Milky Way in all its splendor, the wind howling as I lay happily in my little sleeping bag and suited blanket cocoon. This is what life is about. I'm pretty sure this was the moment of my year I'd been working up to since the year began. I can't remember a moment of my year where life made more sense than on the top of Mount Tsetsera one summer's evening towards the end of the year. My Mozambique trip went on to be epic, as were the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe. With thanks to the help of the local guides, I cleaned up almost every special without a hitch. I cleaned up Beira fairly quickly, and eventually I got into the dreaded Katahdin. Apologies. Day 21, my first visit to the famous Katahdin ever, and the first opportunity to learn the ropes for that matter. I pretty soon came to realize that this place isn't for the weak-willed nor the thin-skinned. Birding is tough. Even the common targets are at least somewhat difficult to find. On top of this, there are so many tsetse flies. No, really, you just stop the car to listen for an alethi, and there are 20 inside already, blood-sucking you with a painful sting or just generally ruining your day. If you're a tsetse fly reading this, buzz off. Let's kind of explain my hatred for tsetse flies. When I returned down south, I was more fulfilled than I'd ever been in my life. I conquered my biggest fear, and it wasn't even that bad. I'd gotten all of the specials. I hadn't gotten all of the specials. I dipped on quite a few birds, but at the end of the day, who was I to care? The biggest trip of the year was under my belt, and the big year was all but guaranteed. I crossed back into South Africa through the beautiful Cozy Bay border post and worked on systematically defeating my last targets. Sooty falcon, Sooty tur, Baylon's Greg, red-headed quillia, Botha's lark, Gurney sugarbird, blue swallow, and mountain pipit. Coqui Franklin. Yeah, this was my 796th bird. One twitch later and a greenbacked honeybird, and spurring lapwing. One cancer pelagic and a red knot later, and I was on 799 birds for the year. And then, on the 20th of December, the moment came one evening while birding with John Kinghorn, the guy who inspired me to do the big year all the way back in 2015. Number 800, Rufus Cheek Nightjar. I don't know how to describe the moment that you've been waiting all year for. It's almost anticlimactic. There's number 800 in front of you. It's all over. Should you be happy that you got it or sad that the chase is over? I decided to spend Christmas with my family rather than going off to some odd place and finding some extra tick. But I did leave one more trip in store after Christmas. I visited the Kruger one last time. Number 801 was Horace Swift. I know, unbelievable. 802 was Senegal Lapwing. 803 was Mottle Smytail. And on the 31st of December 2019, an hour before closing time in Punta Maria, with a guy named Bart Falkins, 804 came in the form of a Dickinson's Kestrel, and my big year was over. When I think back on it, 800 wasn't even the climax of the year. The climax of my year was in Mozambique, and it wasn't even revolved around a magic number, but a change of perspective. My big year taught me more than I could have ever learned in university. It taught me to persevere. It taught me to self-reflect, to appreciate, to love what you do. I learned how to cross a border in Africa and to make food off of minimal effort in the middle of nowhere. I learned that not everyone lives in the same way as you do. I learned to appreciate new perspectives and old scenery. And most of all, I stopped caring so much about my life list, which is easy to say when you have a big list, but it's true. Birding is magical. It's a treasure hunt, but it's also weirdly a way of life. It inspires so many of us to travel beyond the norm and live life to its fullest. For anyone here who has the lingering thought of the big year, and you have the time and the money to do it, I suggest you do. I always thought that it required talent or skill, or you had to be incredibly fit to do it. It doesn't require any of those. All it requires is a little bit of planning and a whole lot of obsession. Thank you for listening to my speech. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, you can just email me, or if this is on Facebook, just mention my name in the comments and I will come and answer any questions you have. Thank you so much.